everybody. This is Joanna Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. Hi, everyone. Joanna Scott here. I want to share more of my thinking about this episode. This season of the podcast is about leadership. I've invited guests to join me to talk about their leadership experiences, either in leading change or moving leaders toward change. This week's episode features my friend and colleague, Sheri Brady, who is the Vice President of Strategy and Program at the Children's Defense Fund. Sheri is a leader in the racial equity space, and often her work requires moving other leaders toward sustainable policy and practice shifts. In the episode, she shares leadership lessons from her years of experience. Sheri has a lot to share, and she brings tremendous thoughtfulness to our conversation about racial equity and leadership. So get comfortable and give this episode a listen. All right, take care. Hi, it's Joanna Scott here. I am so excited to be with you today. Thank you for allowing me to join you in your day, no matter when you're listening. I am delighted about today's conversation. I am talking racial equity and leadership with Sheri Brady, the Vice President of Strategy and Program with the Children's Defense Fund. Sheri is an expert on collective impact, which we'll talk about today, and nonprofit governance, and an early racial equity leader. Sheri has been asking the hard questions about race and equity for a long time. As I mentioned, Sheri is the Vice President of Strategy and Program with the Children's Defense Fund, where she guides the organization's programmatic work, ensuring that CDF's efforts in policy, advocacy, service delivery, and movement building are aligned to maximize the impact on children's lives. Prior to joining CDF, Sheri was the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions. She managed an emerging and expanding body of work focused on supporting community power building and equity, which included overseeing key partnerships focused on building philanthropic field practices around community-centered grant-making. She was previously the Director of Policy at the Kellogg Foundation, where she provided foundation-wide leadership on policy and advocacy grant-making. Y'all, I adore Sheri, and I am thrilled that she came on the podcast to tell a little bit of her story and to talk about leadership. And I don't even want to take 1 second longer talking myself before bringing Sheri into the conversation. So let's get into it. Hi, Sheri. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Joanna. Thanks for having me.
I'm so thrilled you are here, and I'll try not to say that too many times, but I'm excited that you're here and look forward to you telling your story. So that was a little bit of your bio. So now tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
As you mentioned, I am the Vice President currently of Strategy and Program at the Children's Defense Fund. The road here has been an interesting one. I've worked in a variety of places. The main focus of my career has always been, I think, on making lives better for children and families, especially for children and families in communities of color. Actually, I can tell the story. I've told it a lot at CDF, but I was in college. I was a sophomore in college, and Marian Wright Edelman, the founder of CDF, came to speak at my college for the graduation, and I was a volunteer. She literally put me on my path. Like, she talked so passionately about the work that she did, caring for children, and that children should not ever go to bed hungry, that we are the wealthiest country in the world, and the fact the way that we treat our most vulnerable in the sense of children populations is wrong. And she just moved me in ways that I can't even begin to describe. And so I was like, that's what I want to do. Like, I had gone all these things, and I was like, I want to go to law school, and I want to work for children and families. And before that, I had thought about things. I want to be a psychologist. I want to be I want to do all these things. I want to be a photographer. I want to work with autistic children, all these things. But really thinking about where I could create change. And that seemed like the right path. And I also was a huge fan of Perry Mason, not gonna lie. My grandmother, I watched with my grandmother all the time. And so these things all came into play. And it seemed like that was the right thing. So I interned at the Children's Defense Fund. That following year, when I was a junior in college, I had a semester in DC, and then came back that summer, and did end up going to law school. I went to law school Berkeley, and really, when I was did a lot of clinical work. Really was working in the community because I really believe, and I've always believed that people say this now, but that those who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, right? Like, your life.
Yeah.
And just because you don't have a JD from Berkeley or a PhD from wherever, it doesn't mean that you are not acutely aware of what's happening in your world. It actually, you are closer to that because you're not depending on book knowledge or some data from a data set that doesn't ask the right questions anyway, right?
Right.
To tell you what the problem is. Like, this is every day I wake up and I'm deciding if I'm going to have enough money to keep the lights on or feed my kids or pay rent, or can I push that back? Like, these are choices that people have to make. And while I grew up, there were sometimes choices that my mother had to make on some of that. My grandparents were solidly middle class. My mom was a single mother. My dad was in the picture. I don't want to feed that false narrative either, right? Like, my parents were both in my life 150%. But yeah, my mom was a nurse. She had two kids. There were other things that were happening. And so I understood that, but I also had the privilege of my parents understanding the importance of education and making sacrifices so that I could actually have the opportunities that I have. I am forever grateful for that. And when I wanted to pursue something, my parents found a way to make it happen. Or if they couldn't, we put it off a while, but I was very aware of the sacrifice that my parents were making, not in a way to make me feel guilty, but to understand that these were real problems and this was the world that we existed in. And so I find that lens that I bring to the work that I do is utterly valuable, right? Like, because I live this. I remember going to the store with my mother and we didn't have fancy EBT cards when I was a kid on food stamps. We had that funny looking paper so that everyone in the store knew that you had food stamps, right? Like, there wasn't,
Yeah.
you couldn't hide it, right? Like, it was the funny green, the funny orange in the booklet, right? That you had to pull out and count. And then deal with some snotty person telling you that you didn't have enough or you couldn't pay for that with food stamps, right? Like, I remember those experiences. And I never wanted any child to feel that way with their parent, like, or any mother to feel that way or father to feel that way when they're going to a store and trying to provide healthy food for their kids and being mocked because they're paying with food stamps. Like, that had an indelible mark on me. So I think I bring that. I bring my life experiences to my work. And that, I think, is how I got here. So that's kind of a little bit about me.
And that, I love that you shared that. Thank you so much for the gift of sharing that, because I think as you and I both have done policy work in DC, that perspective is often not in the room. And it takes, I think, a lot of courage to bring it into the room, right? Like, have we thought about how this is, like, the reality of X, Y, or Z? So I appreciate the fact that you shared that. And I think in some of these spaces, it's just not there.
And I think that is, one of the things too at Children's Defense Fund. And in my work before then, I really always wanted to ask that question. I always did, about sort of like, are we thinking about the people that we're talking about and we're thinking about their perspective in this room? It feels like a lot of times being poor in this country means that people get to do things to you and not with you. Thinking about all the requirements, like, this is before we had TANF, which we can have our own discussions about that. When it was AFDC, like, literally to apply for these things, you had to make your life so open to the government. And they questioned every decision that you made, right? And like, that doesn't happen in other places. And so people are like, they could just do this. And I'm like, well, do you know what it means to do that? Right? They can just go to 3 different places to apply for services. What if they don't have a car? I'm a grown up with a real job right now and I don't have a car, but at the advent of Lyft, I can afford to take a Lyft everywhere if I needed to. Or, it's easy. I don't have kids, so I don't necessarily take my kids on the metro to get to a place. But are you thinking about those things when you're creating these rules and these procedures that have an impact on folks' lives? Are you really thinking about their experience and how they're interfacing with them if you've never actually had to interface with them or never had to think about what to do with your child while you go to somewhere to fill out paperwork, or will you get home in time to pick up your kid from school, or those kinds of things, and be judged for decisions that you make about that? So I really think it's important that you do that. And I've tried to do that everywhere I go, because you're right, that doesn't happen. And people make assumptions about me based on the success that I've attained or the privilege that I've attained, right? By the fact that I have a JD from Berkeley, I have a master's degree. I mean, I don't have a master's degree. I have a JD or a bachelor's from a 4-year college, and all of those things, or that I've worked at the Aspen Institute, or that I worked at the Kellogg Foundation, and I worked at Voice for America's Children, but I've been in spaces where I have the ear of people. So they make assumptions about what my past must have been like. Sometimes
Hmm.
positively and sometimes negatively. And when I tell them that my mom wasn't technically a single mom, then there's all sorts of things that they flip into this narrative, right? So there's an assumption that my father wasn't there. Nope, my father was right there, right and true or die. To the day he died, he was right there. And so I feel it's my job to remind people that these false narratives that policies are created around need to be questioned, and you need people in the room who actually have this experience if you're going to make true change, and not just sort of what we used to call creaming, right? To push a couple people over the line so that you can feel good about yourself. But it's really about getting those who are most marginalized to be able to have solutions that work for them, because then they really will work for everybody and they'll push everybody up. And so I feel like that's important.
It is important, and I so much appreciate what you said about people having assumptions about you because how you show up in the space or the credentials that you have or your network, the folks you know, the rooms you've been in, that's real. That is real.
And what's even scarier is, so they learn that, but when I walk into a room, sometimes if they don't know anything about me, there's also assumption that you can literally see when I start to speak, when I start to say stuff, or when people are like, "Oh, hey, sure, you're here," yada yada yada. You can see, I've seen it. I've been in spaces where I literally see the shifting of their perception of me because, I have locks. I'm a big girl, I have locks. So there's like, they've already put me in a category, right? She can't possibly know what she's talking about. When I interviewed for my job at Kellogg, like at the time I was young, when I got hired at Kellogg, I literally brought the director's age down by at least 10 years, right? All the other directors were at least 10 years older than me. And in my interview, I remember the questions that people were asking me, and I was like, okay, you should ask hard questions at interviews, but I did it. But when I got the job, I remember someone saying to me, we're in a meeting and I was handling the meeting and I was doing all these things, like, you really know what you're talking about? And I literally was like, yes, because Kellogg often just goes on the street and picks up people to bring into this space that don't know what they're talking about, right? Like, why is your assumption that I got hired, but I didn't know what I was talking about, right? Like, it just was amazing to me that, I was like, for real? So it happens, and it still happens. I mean, it happens less now as, you get sort of, but it's interesting to watch. And so I try to be someone who also opens doors for other people to bring in who might not have the same trajectory of life experiences that you expect to have in this space, right? Like, they might not have gone to sort of top tier schools, whatever, but they're brilliant and they weren't able to go to top tier law schools or top tier other kinds of schools because they financially could not afford it. It didn't mean that they were brilliant. It didn't mean that there was something wrong with them. It meant, look, their economic situation meant they had to make choices, right? But they still got it all going on. And I try to make sure that we think about those things when we hire people. I try to make sure that we think about those things when we talk about the work that we're doing. I'm thinking about collective impact, for example, right? Like, in theory, when it came out, and I say this to the, I know John Kenya and Mark Kramer who wrote the article, and I said it to them, and I will say it here. Like, they put a name on something that was already happening in communities, especially communities of color, for years. Names have power. So they got an article in SSIR, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and put a name on something, right? That was really happening in communities and commoditized it. And, good on them. But then sort of it was like, oh, we have this highbrow expertise of X, Y, and Z. And my whole take on that when I started working in collective impact was, where's the equity in this conversation and where's the community? Very top down. It was cross sector. And I was like, well, one of the sectors needs to be community, right? Like, it can't just be like nonprofits, corporations, government, and yada, yada, because you're actually going into communities and talking to them about the work that they're doing and asking them to work together to create change for themselves. So where are they at this table?
I love that you shared that piece about collective impact because I definitely wanted you to talk about it. So for folks who are listening who may not know, there's a famous article that came out a few years ago that really sort of named collective impact and then called into question how organizations could work together and created a framework or put forth a framework for how organizations can work together in place. I'll link to it in the show notes, but for folks who are in this space, it's a pretty famous article. And why I wanted Sheri to talk about it was Sheri was one of the first people, if not the first, to ask the equity question and how it fit into that work. And at the top of the podcast, I talked about Sheri being an early leader in this work. And I always say, if you've heard any of the episodes or heard me speak, this whole racial equity DEI thing, I'm going to call it a thing, that's happening now and as an industry is not how this work started. So this work started from people asking hard questions like around collective impact. Where's the equity in that work? This is already happening in community. We just now have given it a different name. And I wanted her to talk about that because I think sometimes when things become, I guess, commodified, we
Mhm.
can sometimes lose what the root was. And
Right,
the root was being sure that community didn't get lost in its own work,
right.
right? Can you share a little bit more about that? Because I know you did a lot of work around collective impact and calling that question. And how did you pull that thread into your work?
Yeah, so glad to answer that. When I started the Aspen Institute, I started at a program called the Forum for Community Solutions, which grew out of the White House Council on Community Solutions, which had been a council put in place by President Obama. And they were talking about how communities could be actively involved in creating community solutions and what's the best way to do that. They heard from the writers of the Collective Impact article. That was something that I think was, because this article came about 11, 12 years ago, was sort of something that people were talking about. And so they decided on two things. One, a turnkey population was opportunity youth, who are 16 to 24-year-olds who are not engaged in school or work. And there's some correlation between community indicators and the number of opportunity youth in place. Were a great turnkey population to focus on. And then two, that community policymaking and collaborative policymaking, including collective impact, was a real way for communities to be involved in that. And so when the program moved to Aspen, there was a partnership with FSG, which is where the writers were housed at the time, to really do field building around collective impact. And so it was a collective impact forum, which still exists. And so I was hired to be the staffer. And that was one of the things in my portfolio. My first question really was where's the community in this and where's equity in this? Because I'd read the article, I had a lot of questions about this had been going on, but I didn't see an emphasis on sort of where communities fit into this. It really still felt very top down. And so that would be my question at every meeting. Where's the community voice in this? What's the community think about this? How are we engaging them in this work, right? Like ranging from should they be just, are you even asking them to inform or learn about it to really owning community work that's happening in their community, right? If that's the goal here, who gets to own that? And then how are you thinking about equity? Because we don't want to rebuild systems to look like the systems that we have, right? Like, obviously, we know the systems that we have. I'm going to say obviously, some people might not agree, but it's my time, so I'm going to say it. Obviously, the systems that we have are not equitable and they treat people differently. And they're operating in the way in which they were actually designed to operate, which is to keep some people out. And often those are people who are at the margin. Often those are people of color. And so if we're going to rebuild a system, we need to make sure that we're taking that into account and that we're rebuilding systems that are looking at equity and looking at people who are at the margins and what they need to move off of the margins. And if we're not designing systems with that in mind, we're just sort of recreating the same system that we have with prettier coat of paint. And that was not something I was interested in at all. And so it really was important for me to ask those questions because, again, I believe that my lived experience gives me a different view on problems in the work that I do. And if I didn't have that, I think sometimes there would be mistakes that would be made, or shouldn't say mistakes. I mean, I think, or policies that are not actually impacting the people that we wanted to impact. And if we're not asking people who were there to help, in theory, and I say help, we can have that whole conversation too at some point, but that we're there to work with, let's say it that way, then what are we really doing here? And what are we depending on to create these solutions? And how do we know they work if we're not actually engaging those folks? And so that was really important to me. And I actually remember saying to my then boss, who was new, and believe me, I needed this job. Joanna knows all the details about that. We don't need to hear, but I needed this job. And I said, I'm going to go away from the partnership because, like, this is not the way that you do this kind of community engagement work or this kind of community building work. And so I was really intent about asking those questions in the work and making sure that when we had convenings around collective impact, that equity was one of the things that was on the agenda that was talked about, that all the speakers weren't like white guys. And that it wasn't just this tokenism of let's have one person of color on who's like doing it in the community so she can like share her story about how this great framework helped her and did all that. And it usually was a Black woman, I'm not gonna lie, right? Or a Latino woman, usually a woman of color, in how we could get people to understand that this stuff means you need to think about how it impacts people to create change. You just can't create change based on numbers. Or some report that a McKinsey consultant came in and said, this is what the numbers are telling us, and this is what we need to do to fix it. Well, how is that going to impact people? Are people really going to be engaged and are people really going to want to do it because they don't own it? They don't feel like they own it. They don't have buy-in. You can't have real transformative change if you don't have that real buy-in. And
Yeah.
that's very important to me.
And I appreciate that so much because I certainly have been in a sort of TA providing role, and you go into community and folks don't know why you're there. And because somebody thought it was a good idea that you go and offer this set of services or training or whatever it is, when there's already work happening. When really, if we're really keeping it honest, just cut them the check, right? Like,
And get out the way, right? Thanks. Like,
right? And let's skip the rest of, skip the rest of it, right? And I appreciate that you always, always, always raise those questions. And that's something about you that is so consistent across the different areas of work since we've known each other. You always, always call that question. And I know that can't always be easy.
It wasn't at first. And I will say too about the collective impact article. There's also a second article that came out probably about 2 years ago, again in SSIR, that talked about centering equity. I'm listed as a co-writer.
I was like, did you write that or co-write it? Okay.
I'm listed as a co-writer.
We get credit here. We give credit here.
So just that really talked about sort of like the lessons that we learned from the first article and the work that we did. So just want to also say that when you include that link as well.
Sure.
So there were times when I was in the room and I was like, I'm going to raise this again. And I could see people being like, here's this brown girl on her hobby horse again. And I had to say to my boss at the time, who was a white man, I was like, Steve, I need you to say it because I can't say it one more time. One, I'm exhausted because it's tiring to constantly be asking this question and having people look at you like, they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to think about that. Oh, yeah, we'll make sure that it's diverse. And so we can talk
at
about
the end.
Well,
at
right.
the end, right?
Yeah, we'll make sure it's diverse. That's the other thing. And what does diversity mean, right? Like just because you have classic example from this time, and I'll talk a little bit about my current work soon, but we were doing a report and the people who were hired, there were people of color who worked on the thing, but when they came to present, there was no people of color who were presenting this information. I was like, we talked about this. We've changed sort of the way that we do the sessions. We make sure that there's a diversity requirement, that it's not just, and we talk about it's not just you have someone there who's the moderator, right? Like the person of color is the moderator and all the experts are white, or all the experts are men, or all the experts are whatever, right? That there's a variety of folks who are doing that and that's inclusive, and that people who are speaking have roles of agency in this and not just sort of like, oh, I'm the moderator. So we have a diverse panel because we have a moderator who's a person of color, or we have a moderator who's a woman and everybody else is a man. That's not real, right? Like that's a shuffle. And we had this consultant who did it. So they're like, oh, at this conference we brought our colleague. And what he basically did was introduce the two expert speakers. And so I looked at my colleague, messaging and said, not acceptable. This will not happen again, right? Like, and I'm not saying that I'm like the equity superhero, but I am saying that we have to practice what we preach. And if we continually tell people who are looking to us to be the authority on this, if we are constantly saying that the experts look like this, and the practitioners look like this, and they're not experts, and somehow that's less, that's a problem. And we can't keep perpetuating that.
Yes, I love that so much. And the reason I love that is because it is so easy for some people to be thought of as an expert. Mm-hmm. And so hard for folks who look like you and me, Black women, who know their stuff, right? To be thought of in the same way. So right. I appreciate that you named that because that's real. That is real.
That is real. And one of the reasons, and being at a place like the Aspen where there's a lot of smart people who are there, and they often think that they're the smartest people in the room. And that's across the board because we worked hard to get to where we are. I'm but sometimes I'm like, I'm not the expert on this because it's not currently my lived experience. My lived experience from my childhood, it reminds me to ask these questions, but I have moved from that and I recognize the privilege that I now hold. And so don't depend on me to be the spokesperson for this because my life is different now, right?
Yes.
But I recognize that. And while I could raise some points, there are other things that I'm just not, especially when you're working with young people, right? Like CDF, one of the things that we're very clear about is that our work has to be both community informed and evidence-based. So it is literally like Dr. Wilson, who's the CEO, says, if the problems that we're discussing and the solutions that we're talking about have not started at Big Mama, Grandmama, Abuelita, Mama's table, then we ain't doing the right stuff, right? Because it's important that we are centering those voices because, again, they're closest to the problem. So when we're talking about solutions for young people, how will we engage young people in talking about this? When we want to bring an expert on something, it doesn't need to be me. It doesn't need to be Starsky. In some cases it does. And you do that analysis, but it also needs to be him opening the door for a young person to sit at that table and talk about their experience and talk about the solutions that they have seen and worked on in their communities and get respect for that.
Yes. And talk about it in a way that enables them to sit at that table with dignity and that their story isn't mined for all of the trauma that's ever happened since the beginning of time, right?
Yes.
And that's important too.
No, it is. And I think when I was at Aspen, this was a lesson for me. And I had great teammates at Aspen. So the Forum for Community Solutions, like my forum peeps, I love them to life. But that was a big thing. Like for us, it was not about poverty porn. It was not to get a young person on stage to talk about, oh, the roaches and the thing. And we, my mom was on drugs and da da da. And this program came along and saved our lives. It was like, they could talk about these are the experiences that informed why I believe this, why I do this work, but do it in a way that is distinct and it's their story. It's not my story to share. Like, I don't need to be the conduit. I don't need to translate for them. I can help them develop the skills to be able to own their own narrative and tell their own story. So I feel better about doing that, like helping them develop those skills and increasing their capacity and their leadership to be able to do that. And that's a lot of what we're doing at CDF with the young people that we work with, that it's really about helping them build their capacities, families' capacities, caregivers' capacities, and young people's capacity to be able to tell their own story, to be able to advocate on their own behalf, and help them provide the tools for that. And in the places where we can't get them in the door, then we are in the door for them. And we know that what we're saying is the stuff that really works for them because we've talked to them. We've had that conversation or like, what is the things that worked for you? And we go back to them on a regular basis, not in an exploitive way, but like, yeah, if this is not the right thing, then we need to know. Because if these solutions are not helping you, if these programs that are coming up are not doing what they need to do for you, then we need to know. And it also means investing in communities, not just sort of big national organizations. Like it means there are people in community that are doing this work, local community-based organizations that are on the ground that have been run by the same person for many years, but have not gotten an investment from the Ford Foundation, from Kellogg Foundation, from Name the Big Foundation. They've gotten so a big group has gotten that money and then they're like, oh, they've realized, oh, we don't really know any Black people. We don't even know any, Latino people. We don't have them in our really. So we need to give this local organization, we got a $20 million grant. We're going to give them $10,000 to do all this work. Voulet talks a little bit about that in his work. And, he's talked about it in Nonprofit AF, right? Like, I remember he spoke at one of the Collective Impact meetings, and I did a little dance. It's on YouTube because I was fangirling like crazy when I introduced him. But it's on YouTube. Not a bash bite at all.
Yeah, I'm a fan of his work too.
And so really that, you get these groups that are these big organizations that are names that get lots of money. And then when it comes time to actually do the work on the ground, they give out a pittance to local organizations for a variety of reasons, like, oh, we need to basically co-opt your list. We need to do this, but not really paying them for the work that they're doing, giving them in these groups because they need to survive and they believe it's about the work, do it because they're trying to survive and they're trying to create change in their community. And it's like that model, it's shifting. It is. I'm not going to say it's all bad. There are other ways of doing grant making now that where people are actually thinking about how community voice in that, thinking about engaging in communities in a different way. But we've created a whole sector that people who are doing good work have to go to people with resources and beg for money. I think we need to think about that. And that's just me. Like, you might want to turn that model on its head a little bit. So I think, so I think that is something that I also have worked to think about working with philanthropy and thinking about how do you give grants and how do you have different kinds of relationships with people in community that are doing the work. And so I think it's important that you have people who know what's happening at the table and always creating space for that to happen. Because one of the goals sometimes and sometimes not. I work for, not work, I'm on a board. I feel like I work for them, for a local grant making organization here in DC, the City Fund, where we do community grant making. And for years we were working board. That meant we did everything, right? Like now we have a ED and thank God she does a lot of it and we're hopefully moving to governance. But that was the thing, right? Like the grants are made by folks in the community. Some of us are community members and we sometimes served on the board, but the overall people were people who were doing the work in community. And we don't give out necessarily large grants, and some of it's just helping a local neighborhood, but they're creating a change and they're making a change for their community in the ways they want to do. They're not necessarily getting involved in the nonprofit industrial complex, as people call it. They don't necessarily want to grow and be bigger things. Some of them do, some of them don't. Thinking about that, but their experiences are what matter. And it's important that we think about what funding looks like in ways that brings that to the table.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that is such a critical question, right? And I certainly have seen that example you gave about big organizations getting a grant and then like giving out a little bit of money to folks who they couldn't do their work without.
Right.
And giving a small portion of what the grant. Yes, totally have seen that. Totally have seen that. I wanted to pivot just a little bit and ask you a little bit about what you think about racial equity in leadership and the intersection. So, in thinking about all the different experiences that you've shared with us, that you've
Mm-hmm.
had, what do you think is the relationship between those two?
I do think about that a little bit because what does that mean? Because one of the things that we need to recognize too, right? Equity is not equality. Like everything is not going to be equal. And sometimes you have people who are leaders who have to make decisions that balance a variety of things, right? But I do
Mm-hmm.
think that one of the things you have to think about is who you have as a part of your leadership strategy, who is at the table, who is a part of helping you sort of create solutions, and are you making space for them to actually have real voice and agency in the space? Because I think being a leader means knowing when to follow and when to lead and when to walk side by side, right? Like there are going to be some times where you have to be like, look, this is what we're trying to get accomplished. We have to do it this way because of X, Y, and Z. Also being clear and transparent and letting people know that. And letting people know sort of like the train is moving in this way. And sometimes the train, everybody doesn't need to be on the same train ride, right? Like I think that that's also the thing we need to think about. And that's okay, right? It's okay. We're moving in this direction. This is kind of how we're trying to get there. Here are some decisions and being clear. These are decisions that I'm going to make as the leader. These are decisions that I'm going to ask for input on. These are decisions that you get to make based on in the shared leadership model, right? Like I'm here and you are leading at this level and you're leading here. And there are going to be some decisions that you get to make. We've created this boundary universe that we've drawn and we know where your levels of the decisions that you get to make are and where you have input and where there's some where you're not going to get to make that because of whatever the reasons are. And that's okay. Like, I don't want us to think that it becomes a commune or a free for all. I don't think that's what equity and leadership is because then there's chaos. And some people like chaos. I am not a person who likes chaos. Let me just be clear. Like some sense of order and process, not for the sake of process, but so that I know how decisions are made. And when people ask me, I can say, this is how this decision came to. I don't necessarily agree with it, but at least I know how we got here. And I make decisions about whether or not that's right for me every day. And so I think that that's a thing. And as we think about equity, right, we're talking a lot about racial equity here, but it's coming up a lot, I think, in leadership, in generational leadership. And
Oh, yes.
like, because,
Mm-hmm.
I'm squarely Gen X, right? Like there are things that I believe. I believe that millennials and Gen Zers, they have a very different approach to it. But I think it's very interesting that I'm gonna say something that's probably gonna get me in trouble, Joanna. So I've done this to you in the past. So I apologize. That sometimes they're like, I want cookies for this. I'm like, come on, you're a grown up. You really are your real life grown up. But it's like, if we don't like something, we're just gonna quit. Okay. Like I said in the past, I said it when we worked together, I said other people, like every day that I get up, I make the decision about whether or not I still work for the Children's Defense Fund. I turned on my computer today. I still work for the Children's Defense Fund. Yay! Like I went to the, you know what I mean? But like every day, it's a personal decision that you make about these things, and you do what's best for your family when you have to do them, right? Like I mean, that's what sometimes being a grown up is. People are like, you should make the workplace the best you can. Yes, you should, but that doesn't mean the best for me and the best for you might not be the same. You know what I mean? Like, so there's going to be some things where you have to give and take, right? Like, I think that that's part of being a grown up and navigating sort of the real world. I feel that way, and I could be wrong. I don't have kids, so I'm not passing this on. I need things I love, but like, but I do think that that is a part of the thing. When people say that, they're like, "Oh, they're so brave." Like we have all been doing that. Black women for generations have had to make decisions about where they work based on the needs of their family, and sometimes they couldn't quit because they had to, but they were like, "I got to put on and I got to go through because my babies need food, my babies need formula, my babies need whatever." So this is not new, but I also like it's a generation thing. Like, and if you don't give me what I want, we had a situation when we were together, and I was like, I can't help you with that. Like, this is the way we're moving, and we've been very clear with you about this is the way we're moving. If this is not where you want to move, then you probably need to think about what your next step is. That sounds a little harsh, and I don't mean it to be harsh, but I've made decisions about jobs. I'm like, yeah, this ain't for me no more, right? But I do think so. That doesn't talk about equity, but I think that is this thing. But to allow people sort of this grace in this place to understand where they are and being clear about it and doing it, following through. So, like, if you say that this is a decision I get to make, let me make it. And if it's the wrong decision, let's talk about it, why it might be the wrong decision, but also listen to me when I tell you this is why I think it's the best decision based on my analysis of it. So I think it means looking around the table too and making sure that everybody at the table, while they might not look like you, they still might think like you. That's another thing I think when we talk about inclusion and diversity and those things, like all Black people are not a monolith. All Latino people are not a monolith. We don't all think the same way. So there are going to be people who might look like you, who might not think like you. And that's okay. Sometimes it annoys me, but hey, that's because I'm a grown up and You don't agree with me, right? But
I know. And I definitely stand in solidarity as a Gen Xer myself. It's the way that I've seen that so much in my own work that not only are those differences real and meaningful and impact the workplace, but are also racialized.
yes.
And so that, I mean, we can have a whole nother episode talking about that, but that is real in terms of the expectations of like the things we did to get where we are. Like all of that stuff is around expectations at work and all of that stuff. So I appreciate that you named that.
And
So I want to ask, oh, go ahead. No, go
Let me
ahead.
say something that too. And I think that is a thing that I struggle with when working with younger people, right? Because I do feel like we were conditioned in some ways to be like, there is a hierarchy here. Like the boss wants it done this way. We do that. We do ask some questions. But so in finding that balance between, yes, respecting the position that someone is in, because I do sort of respect authority, but I respect the position. So there's another thing. Like I would not agree with my ED on some stuff or my CEO, but I would never challenge that person in a meeting full of people. Because part of my job, that's not, because one, I think it creates conflict within the organization that is not healthy for the organization. So, like behind closed doors, we have discussions about disagreements. But I also realize that that's a general, like, so, if some people are like, you just do what they say, I'm like, I don't necessarily agree with that. But I think you think about and you strategize about the best way to do it. And I don't think sometimes just being like, because people get entrenched, because that's how I get. If I feel attacked, I'm like, okay, you know what? You've lost me and you've lost the argument. And if I can make a decision unilaterally, because some of us are petty people. Like we're all people. We're human, and sometimes petty comes up, right? Like I'm not gonna lie. So I think that that's the thing. I think also as we're thinking about sort of equity and what leadership actually means, and thinking about how you challenge, I think you make calculuses about that.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate you sharing that. I feel like we can have a whole offline conversation about that. I want to ask you a question as our time wraps. I want to ask you a question that I ask everybody who comes on the pod, but I want to ask it for you in a little bit different way. So if you had one piece of advice to give leaders, or maybe a leader you're working with, either in your current role or in community or in any of the spaces you're in, because you're in so many different spaces, about how to be more intentional about racial equity in their journey, what would you say?
One, I think always asking yourself who you're listening to and who's around the table, and ask it on a regular basis. Don't get comfortable. Don't get comfortable with, oh, I've done my, at the beginning, I made sure that I had different voices and that kind of stuff. Continue to ask yourself that, right? Like, who am I listening to? Who is advising? Who is here? Are we missing someone? Has someone left that needs to be replaced? Again, like, I don't, and not in a tokenism way, and also how you're listening to them, right? Like, not that it's like I have you here so that I can say that I have you here, but I'm still making all of the decisions. I think it's really thinking about how you're listening and how you're taking in this information and being willing to admit that you're wrong. Like, I know Brene Brown does a whole thing, and I've actually never really listened to the podcast. I've heard her speak in other places, but like about vulnerability, but being able to admit that you're wrong and that you don't know all the answers as a leader can be helpful. And I know it's hard. It's hard for me. I think it's hard, especially for people of color, especially of a certain generation, because we were expected to not just be 100%, but 150%. And if we weren't 100%, if anybody could poke holes in something, that was a reason to deny us. And so I think that is a struggle, and something sometimes I'm like, it's okay to say that you're wrong. And I don't know the answer to that, but I know where I can find the answer. Let me try to find the answer. That kind of stuff. I think that's what I would say, because I feel like we want to hold on to sort of power and thinking about what power is, right? Like power shared is power strengthened, and people don't often realize that. Like I think our Western approach to it is like, I must hold all the cookies. It's okay to share the cookies, right? Like it's okay because it's about the work. And so I think that would be my advice.
And if people want to know more about your work, where can they find you?
So they can find me, childrensdefense.org is the website for the Children's Defense Fund. That's where you can find out more about the work that I'm doing now.
So thank you so much, Sheri. I appreciate you so much and the gift that this conversation has been. So thanks for coming on the pod.
Of course.
Until next time.
Until next time.
That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care.